Okay, good morning or afternoon, I think, for at least a couple of you. Welcome to I believe this is our third meeting with this Workstream group. Thanks again for joining. Our agenda today is we're going to start by going around the call here and asking everybody to give a quick introduction by providing the name and company they're from. After that, we'll be providing an update on our annual conference. It's scheduled for March 2021 in Foster City, California. An update about what's going on with this Workstream group, which in many cases is asking updates from the speakers and from the panelists, and then we're going to do a poll. So with that said, can we go around and get an update, have everybody do a brief introduction? I'm going to stop sharing for a second.
Hi, Bill. This is Charles Enriquez. I'm with Allogene Therapeutics.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Rich Nelson. I'm from Exelexis.
I'll jump in. Christopher Jacks, Catalent, Kansas City Packaging business.
Hi, this is Sonia Jekyll, Senior Global Trade Compliance Manager with BioMarin Pharmaceuticals based in San Rafael, California.
Julie Gladys, Bayer Pharmaceuticals.
Matt Burns, Gilead Biosciences.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Deep Sengupta with DSG Global Academy.
Hi, I'm Tony Smith with Arcus Biosciences.
Good morning, Beth Walkenbach, Keck Graduate Institute.
Good morning, Rick Montenario. I'm at Clinical Services.
Morning, Tony Stolas. I'm with Slalom.
Morning, Aaron Lee with Veer Biotechnology.
Okay, did we miss anybody?
Devendra Mishra, BSMA.
Okay, welcome everybody. And thanks for joining. So first topic on the agenda after intros is wanted to share with everybody an update about our upcoming annual conference. So I'll pause for a second. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so this event is a two-day event, March, as you see on the screen, March 20 and 21. I'll be sending the slide deck to everybody along with a recording of this meeting after today's call. And you'll see at the top there's a link. That link will allow you to click on and see the details behind what I'm explaining here. But suffice it to say, day one is going to be a full day that will include plenary sessions, vendor exhibits, and that evening a social event that everybody, I'm sure, will find will be a great time for enjoying yourselves, meeting your peers, listening to music, and everything else that for those of you who attended last year were able to experience. The second day is all about clinical up to commercial launch supply chain. And the topics that we've scheduled will include panel discussions, one on clinical supply plan strategies with a focus on drug substance and drug product planning. Second is identifying ways to reduce clinical supply waste. The third topic is, what do you do when a study is closing to ensure you're ready for the inspections that the regulatory authorities are expected to do prior to providing approval for commercial launch of that indication. There will be a debate by some supply chain professionals on should a company have one combined or two separate supply chain departments when supporting commercial and clinical products. And then the last two I put in red because it's pertinent to this group in particular. The first is evaluation of clinical and R&D products for importers and exporters. And the next, which I'm going to be seeking some input from this group today on, will be possibly navigating through the complexities of GDP in a global supply chain. And when I say possibly, one of the things that we are hoping to find out more from you folks on the call is how many of you are involved in GDP, and are there specific challenges within that area that you might find useful to learn more about, or are there other areas besides that that you might be more interested in hearing about? So I've prepared a poll to try to solicit some of that information from you. Before we get to that, you might recall that many of you who were involved with this group from the get-go received a meeting invitation for monthly meetings. I think our first meeting, we decided that we were going to be monthly on the second Tuesday of the month. But we took a step back and said, maybe that's maybe more than what this group might want, at least in the beginning. So I did two things. The first thing is the original meeting invitations were sent out to my entire distribution list. Now that those folks, at least those who have been part of one of our first couple calls, know what this group is all about, I sent out an email asking those folks, are you still interested in being part of this group? So that rather than going forward, sending out an email to the entire list, I would only send it out to those who specifically said, yes, I want to be part of this group. And I'm happy to say that we have over 30 individuals from 23 companies, and I've listed them here, who said, yes, I want to be part of this group. Now, having said that, it's possible that not everybody reads my emails, and it's possible that there are people who weren't aware that if they didn't tell me they wanted to be part of this group, they weren't going to get a meeting invite. So I'm going to pass the word around both right now during this call and during our steering committee call that we have this Thursday, letting people know that if you want to be part of this group and I didn't invite you, certainly that's fine. Just let me know, and you'll be invited to our future meeting. So after this call, I will be sending out new meeting invitations. As I said, that they will be on the second Tuesday of every month. And I have a slide after this one that tells you specifically what dates this year those are going to that are going to take place. So any questions or comments so far? So I'm now gonna ask the audience to provide some feedback on what areas within logistics or outside of logistics are you involved in. So I'm gonna need to stop for a second. Okay, I'm gonna start with I'm not quite able to get the survey going that I was hoping to allow people to answer these questions specifically. So I'm gonna go just reach out to all of you on the call right now and ask you to answer these questions one at a time. So the first question is, can we go down the list here? And I'd like to find out from people. I suspect some of you, logistics is your full-time job. It's at least 75%. And then there are those of you who maybe it's half of your job. And then there's I suspect a handful of you where you are wearing many hats, maybe responsible for all of supply chain, and therefore logistics, and I'm defining logistics as anything around transportation, imports, exports, trade compliance, whatever, is you're involved in, but it's probably less than 25% of your total function. So can we sort of go down the list right now, and I might not be a perfect way of asking the question, but can we go down the list and ask people, are you A, this is most of your job, B, half of your job, C, a percentage, a smaller percentage of your job?
Bill, I could start. For me, Catalent, about 25%. So I'd say C.
Okay.
So I can go then next. Giuliano Damon Dermavant. I would also say about 25% of my job.
Okay.
And same for me, Bill.
Right.
About 25% is transportation logistics.
I would say 25% for myself as well.
Wow. Okay.
It would be about 50 for me, Rich from XLX.
All right.
I'm pretty much full-time. Oh, sorry.
No problem. Yes, Thomas, for me as well, pretty much full-time.
Okay.
I added in the chat, but I put for global trade compliance, import export operations is about 100% for me.
Okay.
Matt Burns here. Global trade compliance, 100%.
Okay.
Hi, Bill. This is Charles. It's less than 25%.
Okay. Do we have any more?
Yeah, this is Dan. It's probably close to 100%. It's all either trade or transportation related at an executive level. So we have other responsibilities, but that's all we think about.
Okay. All right. Anyone else?
Bill, it's 100% for me as well.
Okay.
International trade compliance.
Okay. So it looks like we have 6 that said 100%. 1 is maybe right in the middle, and 5, it's maybe 25% or less. So okay. Thank you for that information. Second question on the survey is it's hard to tell from people's titles and also from the infrastructure of your organization whether or not you have any type of responsibility for good distribution practices. As a matter of fact, I'll go as far as to say I'm not sure if it's the case now, but I remember when GDP was first rolling out, it was more specific to commercial than clinical. So I really have a 2-part question here. The first question is, everyone on the call, are you involved in supporting good distribution practices? And the second part of that question is it considered an expectation within your organization that the GDP practices be adhered to for the clinical side of the business? So again, we could go down and
This is Rich from Excellence. It's a yes to both.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Dan. I mean, at this stage of the game, it's table stakes, right? If you don't have GDP in there, then it's just not going to work, right? You have to have it clinical through commercial, to a certain extent GMP as well.
Okay.
Same for me, Catalent.
Same for me.
Same here at BioMarine.
Same here as well.
Same for us as well.
Same at Arcus.
Me as well, Bill. Same.
Okay, let me put the question differently then. Is there anybody on this call where GDP is not a part of your responsibility? Now, next part of this question is, are the requirements that are defined for GDP defined? Is it your responsibility for understanding what these requirements are and putting in place whatever practices are necessary to achieve and maintain those requirements? Or is there another department, it could be, I don't know, a compliance department, a regulatory department, or some other group outside of your function that basically keeps up on what these requirements are, tell you what it is, and then you take it from there?
I think compliance works hand in hand with quality, right? Those are the 2 natural bedfellows for that topic. Of course, the implementation of it practically, rolls down to the operational teams, of course, but primarily it's thought leadership from reading regulations, from compliance, quality helping, write those processes up with the operation.
Yeah, Dan said it exactly how I would say it. So same thing, regulatory, but it falls up under our quality department.
Yeah, same on our side here. QA tells us was WHO or FDA or whoever wants what are the requirements, and we have then to transfer these requirements to our daily business.
Is there anybody on the call who is representing that quality compliance group, so to speak? Sounds like no. Okay. I thought when I got some titles from the people who requested to be part of this group, that at least 2 or 3 of the people's titles sounded like they were more in the regulatory compliance part of the organization than the supply chain / logistics part. Maybe they're just not on this call.
Sorry, I'm part of regulatory. I had to step away for a moment.
Okay, I had a feeling you were one of them, Julie, then when you introduced yourselves in the past. And I thought that person from, are they on the call from BioMarin, that their title sounded like it was a compliance regulatory title. Is that person on the call still?
Yes, hi, Bill, Sonia. No, I'm Global Trade Compliance. So
Okay.
anything related to import-export operations.
Okay.
But we do work hand in hand with regulatory team.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thanks for sharing that. That's very useful information. So the last question on the survey, and this is the most important questions, is that we are looking for some input on what our, well, first, let's talk about the one topic that we already have the speakers for at our annual conference. And we already have a tentative title, which is the valuation of clinical and R&D products for importers and exporters. Our speakers on that panel are Jeff Bernier from Bayer, Dan Bell from Markin, Aaron Lee from Ver, Giuliano Demon from Dermavant, and moderator will be Matt Burns from Gilead. So the first question for that is, well, let me back up. This group is scheduled to have their first call shortly to define the objective of this panel and define the questions and information that will be shared for that particular session. But we want to make sure that it's addressing your needs, your questions, your concerns. So, so I'd like to open it up to the audience and ask you folks to first say, do we want to limit this topic to clinical and R&D products? Is there enough substance on just that area of importing and exporting that there's more than enough to talk about there? Or you feel it should include areas beyond that, such as commercial?
I'm not involved in the clinical space, so I would have little to say about that, to be honest. But
So you want it to be commercial. Is there any difference between one and the other when it comes to how you go about importing and exporting?
Yes, there's a difference.
Yes, there is.
Yeah, Bill, and I would say because our business is about 90% clinical, 10% commercial, I think it would be good to touch on both.
Gotcha.
I think
And whatever those differences are. So again, for me,
Yeah.
it's such a small percentage. I'd be curious to what those trigger points are between each.
So maybe that's one of the questions for the survey, is helping people understand, at least, especially those who haven't quite reached the stage where they've launched their first product. What will be different between the two as they turn the corner, looking for approval of their first product? Okay. So we can say valuation of clinical and commercial, or just say products for imports and exports. Okay. All right. This is still a pretty broad subject, and I'd be interested to have people provide, some specific examples of what types of questions or what type of war stories have you heard of, or even experienced yourselves, that you think would be useful for the audience to hear about at this panel?
I guess I have an idea. Something that could be brought up for biologics, whether it is definitely for a clinical space or even for R&D, would be the difference of knowing when you need to go to the CDC or one of the other government agencies to submit for a permit to import materials. I mean, there's nothing worse than having a material you'll think is something standard coming in, and the next thing you know, the CDC and some other government agencies, including Fish and Wildlife, jump in, and then you're triaging, trying to resolve the issue for the import.
Okay, thanks, Julie.
Look, if the topic is around valuation, I think, you know, the elephant in the room as you go from clinical to commercial is understanding that no, you are not selling it, but yes, it has a value. That kind of valuation and what the implications are as you know, your import, export, your trade activity is for clinical can have a real impact on when you move into commercial. And there's plenty of war stories about, you know, Latin American countries enforcing pricing based on the clinical trial pricing, Eastern European countries building valuations on other similar products in the market. So there's just a ton of great valuation stories. I think raw materials is another one that gets overlooked, right? Because they fit into different parts of the tariff and they attract duties, whereas perhaps therapies and drugs don't. And so valuation and those costs, you know, perhaps aren't in the budget, haven't been figured out, and how you deal with that. There's some areas there for sure that people will have, you know, interests and questions about, I expect.
And I would also suggest that while you're discussing that, hey Dan, how you doing?
Hey Rich, good to see you.
That the prototype, the harmonized tariff codes for prototypes and the applicability of them to clinical trial medications get included in the conversation. That's something I get asked about a lot. And
yeah,
that they do not apply. And I spend quite a bit of time seeing people that want to try to use them that they do, that I'm right. If I'm wrong, I'd like to hear why.
Yeah.
I think an interesting challenge that we are looking at now is because we're a startup or scale up by now. Intercompany transfer pricing, which was the basis for valuation at the beginning. And as profitability shifts around the business, how do you adjust your TP and do you need to adjust your valuation as a result of that?
Matt, I'm gonna pick on you for a minute as the moderator for this event. Any thoughts that you were thinking about relative to the subject matter for this panel?
Yeah, no, these are great topics that are coming up. I'm actually scribbling down notes over here for the working session. Yeah, these are great questions. So I think Dan pointed out the difference between commercial and clinical pricing, right? Commercial pricing is generally going to include your profit, your royalties, and typically about a 4% increase for transfer pricing between international entities. Whereas clinical materials, you're generally always going to be looking at computed method 5. It's a built-up cost. And that's what I've seen with a lot of the groups that I've worked with. It is something that usually has not had a whole lot of focus, basically. But yeah, no, these are great topics. I would say, including raw materials that Dan brought up, these should all be treated independently and really to protect your organization. what you want to do at all times is go through and show that you've gone through a method to determine what that value is. And it becomes a little bit of a challenge with clinical, right? Because your standard accounting department is not keeping track of the cost. They're going to basically value the material at zero until it's been commercialized. Otherwise, it kind of throws the books off if it's not commercialized. So with that, it's really sitting down. You're going to get your API costs. You're going to figure out what your average running costs are for either tableting or loading into files, your overhead and so forth. And basically, just like method 5 sounds, you're just basically computing the value, adding up those items and coming up with a per vial or per tablet. Or even per bag. I mean, if we're talking about biologics, cost basis. So yeah, no, these are great topics for the working sessions and the seminars and session in February.
Has anybody on the call ever been audited by the authorities with respect to the values that they put on their imports or exports?
Yes, of course. We have several times, of course, by various authorities, countries. And one of the questions always I have in this audit is, what happens when you have first a clinical trial over as well, new product, and then it's suddenly marketed. So it's suddenly commercially available, and you still do clinical trials for a new indication or phase 4 or whatever. So of course, then you have to adjust, and then they ask you, why is now the valuation so much higher than before? And these are the typical questions you need.
Yeah. Anyone else on the call?
I think there's a good for example here for census, right? Census warning. So if you're in the biologic space or you have an API that's millions of dollars a gram, triggers a census warning. And so, a request for additional information to support the valuation on the high end as opposed to the low end is very common. I see that with a lot of our clients that have biologics. So, understanding what triggers that and how to respond to those is important. And I have to say, I often see from CROs nominal values put on clinical drug, which is just crazy, right? That triggers all kinds of upset. And so, the importance of not using nominal value, but census is a good one to talk about because, I'm sure a lot of you have very valuable drugs, especially in advanced therapies these days.
Yeah. It's incredible. I think on a previous call, and I was nodding my head that then there is how many companies who maybe have this area of responsibility run by people who maybe don't know yet what they don't know, are told to simply put $1. And I've been there myself. Or there was one organization I worked for based in Foster City that was audited, and one of the practices they had was in the shipments of materials back and forth between their California site and their UK site were putting, since it was the same company, they were putting a very nominal value. And many of you on the call know that it's supposed to be treated at arm's length. So at the end of the day, they get fined $1 million. And I remember the discussions early on, what is arm's length a price when you're dealing with intercompany transfers? Is that a pretty, is that a question worth putting on the panel? Because is it obvious what an arm's length price is and how you determine that? Or is that pretty subjective where you ask 10 people and get 10 answers?
Yeah, I think that's a great call, Bill. That's probably something that we want to focus in on a little bit as well there. In my experience from some of the companies I've worked with, the arm's length, generally that term did not have a whole lot of meaning with the folks. And what we've seen with the nominal values going back and forth, oftentimes logistics groups aren't thinking they're doing anything wrong. They're not actually exposed to the regulations that dictate that they actually have to use a valid price, right? And where they get confused with the arm's length when they're using the nominal values is they're not realizing that they actually have to declare the actual value of the goods going through. So in a lot of times with this, because they're not actually getting the support from their accounting or finance group, they're basically coming back saying, oh, it's worth zero for customs purposes. And actually, a lot of times the issue does start with the finance and accounting group. They're actually the ones that are saying, oh, just use a nominal value, just say it's worth $1 and so forth. And it's because they actually haven't done the background to actually figure out what those costs are. And they generally don't until something's commercialized. So yeah, this is a great item to add as well here. Just kind of that definition, and so people can fully understand what at arm's length is. And it's basically not giving any benefits to your partner.
Your partner, your intercompany.
Okay. Okay. I think we've, thank you everybody for the input there. Matt, I think you've got some good input for your upcoming meeting to start defining what the objective is, questions that you and the panelists will want to tackle there. So thank you for everybody there. Okay, the other thing I mentioned is, we're planning on a second topic for this event, and wanted to get your input on this. And we heard offline a number of suggestions of what this other topic might be. One example would be, something specific to good distribution practices. And I know that's a very broad subject. So it begs the question, do we want to talk about, some of the challenges and solutions, and cast a wide net over that and come up with some examples of challenges and solutions on GDP? Do we want to focus a little more specific in that area? Like what are some of the challenges and solutions on the clinical side of GDP? Or maybe we want to say, what are some of the challenges and solutions as it relates to the EU or to gene therapy and cell therapy products, given that that's relatively new area that has its own unique challenges that I know a lot of companies, because it's relatively new, are trying to fend on their own as pioneers how to address these challenges instead of collectively sharing what each of those companies have experienced. So without rambling on more, I'll start by saying, what are your thoughts about something on GDP? Or is something such as how do you establish a trade compliance program? Or what is the difference between what are the responsibilities of an importer versus an exporter? It can be whatever topic you folks guide us to take. So I'll open it up to everybody and ask your thoughts and opinions on what you think this second session should be all about.
I'll give you my 2 cents there, Bill. A big part of what we're talking about is de-risking that supply chain, and there's inherently bigger consequences at a clinical side in having a failure if you haven't de-risked both the trade aspect and then the distribution, the transportation part, the GDP part. All rolls up to risk. How do you eliminate as much of that risk? So there's a whole bunch of compliance things you can do to get right, and then there's temperature control of or a cold chain part for the GDP side. So they kind of fit underneath de-risking. I also think there's some basic elements around import and export, and just, as you say, building a trade compliance team, especially if you're kind of a little bit new at this. You got accountants telling you, nonsense usually about trade, and then you got brokers confusing you with, big words and lots of regulations. So I think both of those are valid, but for me, it's all about how do you get a successful outcome? How do I get my novel new medication out to the patients where it needs to do, and so we can run our trial efficiently and not have a big, I think somebody said it, the CDC said, yeah, no, you can't bring it in because you don't have this form, permit, whatever. That's how I see it anyway.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Anyone else? Julie, if you're still on the call, be interesting from your perspective, particularly because your role is very heavily into the compliance regulatory part. And two, correct me if I'm wrong, your organization is now into gene therapy. And I'm wondering, is that opening up a whole new set of challenges and, that might be worth hearing about?
Well, I can honestly say that it is interesting because I will say it is a learning curve for me with gene therapy. But yes, it does pose interesting questions on what we're importing and exporting. From a regulatory perspective, not including, well, and including gene therapy, as an importer or exporter, as an exporter, you need to be aware of all of the import requirements of the country that you're shipping to, as well as knowing the requirements from the US for the materials that you're importing. So I think that is a major hurdle for any company trying to get their product into or out of, if out of a country if you're new to the area, because just because it's one way in the US, which a lot of us know, the US from a regulatory standpoint is far different than from the EU or LATAM or South America. So though you may think that you've got it down for the US for your imports, when you exports, it creates a whole other complexity in some respects, because now you're dealing with each and every country that you're importing to, not only from a tariff perspective, from their customs compliance to their regulatory aspects. So
Sounds like quite the challenge when you're on these exports. If you're dealing with all these countries and they all have their own separate rules and regulations.
Right. So you have, say you have the EU, you have your general EU, I'll say, rules on importing into the EU. But once you get down to the country level, then you also have to be knowledgeable, or at least know who to ask about whatever specific country's regulation would be for the import. And that specifically, I'll say more that I've had to deal with is on the agricultural end. So if you're bringing in, you're selling gene therapies or like cell lines, each country could have a different requirement that you're exporting to.
Have you found, well, Bayer probably does a lot of end-to-end supply chain, and I'm although I'm just speculating here, whether that's the case on the clinical products, but I know that on some of the virtual companies, at the very least, you're relying on your CMOs and CROs and CRAs and so forth to know what these requirements are. Have you found that they're familiar enough with these requirements to put your trust in them?
Well, at Bayer, we actually review everything prior to importing and exporting with our CMOs and other companies that we import or export with. So we do a document review prior to shipping, exporting out of the US or importing into the US. And if we catch a discrepancy, we work with that CMO for a resolution.
Okay, so Christopher, as a company that distributes these products and therefore is expected to understand what those requirements are, do you have any comments about whether or not distributors have the tools and the knowledge to do what Julie has described.
I think it's based on your staffing and the experience level that you have here, knowing and understanding and asking the right questions. We seem to have a pretty good grasp of it, at least in my staff. But I could tell you there's other areas within Catalent that do have concerns there, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And Christopher's group is great, by the way.
Thank you, Julie. I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's the same on our side. So we really have to, almost exercise it with the CROs or so to check how it's going, because sometimes you have very limited lead times. So you have lead times of 72 hours from Europe to the US, and there, of course, nothing can go wrong. It's not like normal products. When something goes wrong, you sort it out and it stays 3 days longer at the airport, not a problem. But here it might be a problem, and the product can be destroyed just simply, and that can be hundred thousands, and that's why you really have to, what they said before, you really have to have the perfect knowledge what is all needed and how it's going, and that's so crucial that you can keep the product within the lead time.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Okay, any other comments, suggestions on this second topic that we want to incorporate in the annual conference? Does it feel like we're hearing the word, how do you eliminate risk, which can cover many areas? Do we feel like it should be in some ways focusing on some of these GDP risks versus any other topic that you may have or that I may have thrown out a few minutes ago? Okay, we'll circle back to you on that. Since all your inputs been recorded, we'll listen to what's been said and figure it out from there. Last topic is I neglected to mention that we're going to have a webinar probably middle of February, and based on the input that we received from the folks who were on one of our previous calls, the thinking was that the topic would be on, I think, Dan, you used the words, a tripod when we talked about valuation, classification, 3 legs of the stool, I think you used the words, when we talked about valuation, classification, and country of origin. So we said we would focus on valuation for one event, which will be the annual conference, but that we would take maybe all 3, since they all are so intertwined, and talk about that at a webinar middle of February. So we haven't yet defined exactly what specifically we'll talk about that webinar, nor have we chosen the speakers for that yet. I know there's a few of you who are on this call who were up to the task and said, yeah, if you're going to talk about it, put me on it. So we'll figure that out in the very near future so that we can start preparing for that event. But my question for the folks on the call is, what are some specific issues that you think people will want to hear about in a webinar that covers all three legs of the stool? Dan, I'm going to start with you because you're always willing to share your opinion.
I mean, look, I think those topics are great, right? You know, I use the phrase a three-legged stool, but it really is the case. There isn't, you know, if I just do this one thing, everything will be okay. It's kind of all of it coming together is what we sometimes call a kind of holistic approach to to compliance. One is getting the job done. I need to get my staff from A to B. I must get that right. But then it's also, you know, nobody wants to go to prison. Nobody wants to pay a fine. And nobody wants to get into trouble from their boss. So, you know, it's that kind of holistic, encompassing approach, and really the best ways to talk about it. You can say, here are the rules, right? If you do this, this bit will right. If you do this, this bit will be right. But a lot of the times, it's more important to be able to tell a story. And you mentioned at the beginning, Bill, some war stories, right? People love to hear somebody else's disaster. Somebody else is probably crying at the back of the room because they also experienced the same disaster. But I think that's a nice way to tell it. You can give you know, we can even make one up, but you can have a good scenario that people can identify with. And then really it's talking about strategies on how to solve that, right? How can you build, you know, best practices to address those and grow and learn from that? And it is learning. In fact, I just sat this morning for an hour with my head of trade to try and go back and review last year and coming this year, what changed? Because it does change, and it changes faster, it seems to me at least, in the last 2 or 3 years than it has in the last 20 years. So managing that kind of change in that regulatory field, there's the basics, get those right, but how are you going to deal with some of those changes? And you know what, some of them may be an advantage, right? If you can get particularly good in one area, you're going to have an advantage over your competition. And so there's a commercial conversation to be had there. But you know, I think about these things a lot all the time. It's a bit shotgun approach, but I think those areas that people are interested to hear about.
Yeah, good. Who on the call has a war story or two that would be applicable to this webinar?
I mean, I have one on country of origin with a broker that is importing my material and documentation, making a kind of confusing the difference between the manufacturer and the country of origin in the case where the API comes from somewhere else. So where I had a discussion with the broker back and forth, no, you are using the wrong country of origin, and they're like, yeah, but the manufacturer of the drug product is in that country. I'm like, but the API is somewhere else. And the US view to API, to country of origin, is different from the drug product manufacturing. So back and forth with the broker to get that right information. I can imagine that it's a challenge that a lot of companies face.
And that was for single API agent drug product, right? Yeah, I've come across that before. Yeah, so the U.S. Customs is one of the few organizations in the world that actually they want it for single agent API or single API drug product. They always want to know where the API was made, and even though the drug product might be manufactured in another country, yeah, the U.S. is one of the weird countries. But I am understanding that the UK and Canada could potentially be following that same regulation here in the next couple of years.
Yeah, it's coming.
Sonia, before your arrival at BioMarin, I was on the outside looking in at BioMarin. I'm not sure if you're aware, I retired from there. And for whatever reason, Turkey was always coming up as a war story. I, to this day, never understood what those challenges were. I just recall a lot of ambiguity about whose job was to do what, trying to import clinical drug and clinical supplies into Turkey. Is there a war story behind that that's worth sharing?
So to be honest with you, I joined BioMarin this year. So I think that was prior to me joining. From what I understand, it was basically the understanding who was the party responsible to import the goods. And BioMarine was not set up as an importer record in a country. So that responsibility fell under the distributor or whatever other company was doing, the studies. So so I can give you that kind of story,
Okay.
but I can share something prior to BioMarine, and it was, I want to say 2022, I think around February, where Expeditors was suffer a cyber attack that many people here on the call maybe know. At that time, I was with the company that I was working, we were heavily impacted. In one day, our whole operation went to a complete stop. We had 2 foreign trade zones also impacted by it. So at that time is when you really have to act really quick and find that alternative broker and work with you very closely to start operations as fast as possible. And the lesson learned was definitely always have, not just have one broker, but have multiple brokers, because at that time we didn't have it. So just sharing that story with everyone in the call.
Thank you. Thank you. I think part of the problem that I was again seeing from the outside looking in is back then BioMarine was going through a learning curve. It was going through growing pains. Where the department over the time I went there went from a one-person department, one person wearing many hats, to all of a sudden, okay, let's split out clinical supply chain from regular supply chain, and now let's split out logistics, and then on the regulatory side, they were branching out into specific areas, and then same with the clinical operations side. And then in the middle of all that, CROs and CRAs and clinical group used to feel they were responsible for determining importer of record. And no, logistics is responsible for that. No, we've already done that in clinical supply chain. So I think it became a hodgepodge of because of lack of role of RACI. It became confusing, and therefore having the need to be proactive to get the right records done at the right time, with an expectation that once something's ready to ship, it's supposed to ship the next day. We weren't there, so I don't know whether that's a common theme for a lot of companies, especially those who are going through growing pains, or whether that was a unique situation. But again, that was a war story I would have tried to share if I understood a little more what the problem was, but to this day, I never understood it. Okay. So I know we're running out of time, but I want to thank you, everybody, for your opinion. We're going to reach out to some of you about this upcoming webinar, so we can more clearly define the topic, and we're going to pick on some of you to see if you're able and willing to be part of that panel. So without any else, I'd like to thank everybody for being on their call. And as I said at the beginning of the call, we will send out the slides and the recording of this sometime over the next couple of days. So thanks again to everybody. And hopefully you'll be be able to attend our annual conference in March. Okay.
Thanks, Bill.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Good day, everyone.